1983 is probably one of the, I think, signature pieces in the collection, and goes towards an idea of looking at the collection that can be super broad-minded, thinking about the big issues that he sort of references in the title, but also thinking about an artist where we started off with a gallery in which we tried to talk about, well, how is the contemporary collection different from the modern collection? People are coming to a completely different space and expecting something different. So using the time frame of 1968, we talked a lot about conceptualism and how conceptualism changes the way that we look at art and begin to think about art through ideas. So that first room began with, I think, trying to talk about art and the body in particular, thinking about Nauman and this idea of the early work, being about, well, what can I make in the studio by myself? No materials. He turns the camera on and does various sort of things with the body. We also had one of the major pieces he did in mid-60s, this piece where he's sort of going through the corridor. I forget the full title, but the corridor piece, where he's squeezing his body through. It's only as wide as his shoulders. So it's this very strange kind of piece. So we had that in the first gallery. And then we also had a piece like this, David Hammons' Injustice Case. Another one that is a very, very important part of the collection, but also is dealing with this idea around that time of, how do we talk about art? How is it different? And I think that's what we wanted to really situate, was that there is this difference that happens. Of course, I think 1968, it's all somewhat arbitrary. We could have said, 67 or 69. But at the same time, we wanted to point towards, some of the things that were happening in Europe, some of hopefully evolving and nodding towards the idea that nothing is happening in a vacuum and that the political situation around the world becomes more apparent in a lot of the work. And obviously, that's happening here. This is Hammonds reenacting the trial of Bobby Seale. So when Bobby Seale is bound at the trial from the Democratic conventions, that's what you're basically getting here. So it's not just a portrait of the artist, it's actually a portrait of a political figure. And going on through that room, we also, if contemporary in the more recent sense could be defined through the Koons images, I'd say that contemporary in a more historical sense at LACMA has been defined as Southern California art and Southern California artists. And so we had that already as a line of thought, and we were trying to look beyond that. So within this first room and talking about the body, we also included, I think, a lot more artists of color, and probably a lot more women. Hannah Wilkie was in this room, Anna Mendieta was in this room, Linda Benglis was in this room. So we were also thinking about that. How do we give a different take on what has been shown so far? There's the Linda Benglis. Oh, and then in the following room was a space that was sort of a nod towards minimalist strategies. So there was a wall drawing by Saul Witt. There were two sculptures by Donald Judd. There was a Fred Sandback knit piece. And then in the middle, we threw this down. And so if you did a quick scan of the room and you're thinking about your art history, you might have seen this rectangle in the middle of the floor and been thinking of someone like Carl Andre. But obviously, you get closer and it's not. This is Mona Hatum's prayer mat, which is made of these little stainless steel nails, which would be very painful if one to actually use this as a prayer mat. And then you have the compass in the center, which is pointing towards Mecca. So a whole host of other issues that go on in this minimalist object that obviously has a reference in the past, but becomes something quite different in the present. Next. Okay, so the first room was talking about the strategy of art in the body. The second room was talking about minimalist strategies. And then there was a room that was very much about assemblage tradition. And I think in some ways thinking about it as in many different ways as coming out of a European tradition that can then get discussed and perhaps more defined as an American tradition after the 1961 MoMA show, Art of Assemblage. But it's also something that I think has a really deep connection to vernacular art and craft, very specific also to America and to the American South in particular. So we had several artists in this room, including Ed Keenholz and George Herms, but then also I think a bunch of artists that came out of a more vernacular tradition. Betty Saar, who lives in LA now and has been there. She was born in the mid-20s. So somebody who's been working there for a very long time. So there is that position in Southern California, but it's also one that has roots elsewhere. Also in that room was work by John Outerbridge, and I do have some. There's John Outerbridge, a more recent work by Outerbridge. Of course, he has been making work since the 60s, was a co-founder, along with Noah Purifoy, of the Watts Towers Art Center, and a real force in LA, and somebody who has gotten a lot more popular in the last year via the Pacific Standard Time Initiative of the Getty Museum. It's a bad image of Noah Purifoy's Last Supper that I think I took in somebody's kitchen. You can kind of make out there are like these plates that are made out of the tops of coffee cans, and some dishes that are taken from used sardine cans. So all of this sort of found material that he's using to create his Last Supper. Purifoy is an artist. As Danielle mentioned, I'm working on this solo exhibition of his work. He's an artist who was born in Alabama in 1917. Great Migration, came to LA in the 50s, and worked as a designer and as a furniture maker, was making like hi-fi stereo furniture and stuff like that. And then around the time of the Watts Rebellion, he kind of had this epiphany. He had already started making a little bit of work, but around that time he really sort of found his calling and did a big piece called 66 Signs of Neon. And that was taken all from the refuse and detritus of the Watts Rebellion. So that became his first sort of grand work. And that piece actually, since, in Houston, and thinking about him is the connection with Walter Hopps. Before Hopps ever got here, when he was still working in Los Angeles, he was very close with Noah Purifoy. And or late 60s, early 70s, when Hopps moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the Washington Gallery of Art, the first show he did there was Ed Keenholz. The second show he did there was Noah Purifoy, and it was part of the 66 Signs. So there is that connection that I've been interested in following. The last room, I think, that defined this idea of a post-conceptual sort of trajectory and tried to say this is how the contemporary is different from the modern, was a room that was dedicated to text works. And so this Glenn Ligon Rukin figure, which is now in the exhibition in Fort Worth in his solo show, we first put it in the context of this larger exhibition in a room with works. It was in the same room as the Neon by Baldessari. And Glenn also talks about the influence of Baldessari as being something that made him want to use neon in his own work. Of course, much better known as a painter. Next. The other thing that happens, and since I don't have more images of that text room, I also mentioned there was a piece by Mel Bachner in there that was a piece that's done on the wall directly called Language is Not Transparent. And in that piece, it's kind of going towards the idea that, yes, although we are taking on these more perhaps conceptual strategies and in some cases even didactic strategies, is it necessarily, more transparent than the abstract painting? Probably not in some ways. Okay, and then moving on, so once we get rid of this, we've set down this foundation, and we go on to talk about how perhaps international the collection then possibly can be. Because I think there was a real core of looking at it again, as I mentioned, as a Southern California thing, and we wanted to try and evolve from that position. So we passed Namjoon Pak and then Alighiero Boetti, the Italian artist who made these incredible mappa pieces, embroideries that were done in collaboration with women in Afghanistan. And this is a really great example, and also is great in terms of talking about chronology in an exhibition, because you see the chronology here, and you can see how the world has changed, obviously. I mean, the USSR does not exist like that. The map defining South Africa is completely different now. The Middle Eastern map is much different. Yugoslavia no longer there. So you have this document, this beautiful document that also speaks to the passage of time. Dohos, we also have a large Korean initiative at the museum and recognizing, I think, that presence in Los Angeles. And Doho was part of a big group show that happened a couple of years ago that actually came to the MFA, Your Bright Future. So we also were trying to keep in mind what is our exhibition history and how do we work off of that? Not only what is in the collection, but what has been discussed as as a hallmark of showing art at the museum. Gerhard Richter's 48 portraits. I mean, in some cases there are these, I think, standout works. This is obvious. This is not the edition of paintings that he created for the German pavilion at 1972's Venice Biennial, but they went back in 98 and did this 4 sets of photo reproduction. So still, I think, a very a monumental type work that sat in a bridge gallery all by itself. And there are probably 2 or 3 Richters in the collection, which isn't a lot, I think, when we take into account how important he is as an artist over the last 50 years. For a museum that big, it would be nice if we had more. Next. Kerry James Marshall, De Style, great painting by this artist, and there is an LA connection in that. Although most identified with Chicago at this point, Kerry went to Otis as an art student, consciously went there to seek out Charles White, the great draftsman, to work with him, as did David Hammonds as well, went to LA also looking to work with Charles White. So this piece came into the collection relatively early on, I think while Kerry was still in LA. And although born in Birmingham, actually spent most of his growing up in Los Angeles. So, this wonderful piece. Next one. And Zhang Wan, some work from 2007 that we were just gifted last year. And again, I'm going into some acquisitions, reminds me about how the challenge of trying to collect art, and you look at the auction prices, it is truly a challenge. This was a gift from a collector who has worked with the museum a lot, a woman named Audrey Hermes, who has gifted a lot of portraiture specifically to the collection. So we were fortunate to be able to include this work. Paul Pfeiffer, again, another recent acquisition, and somebody that I should mention my colleague Christine Kim, we worked on the exhibition together, and both of us